I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of AML Detectives. Today we have a very, very special guest, Dennis Lormel. Thank you, Dennis, for joining. It's wonderful to have you.
Justin, thank you. I appreciate the invitation. It's very flattering.
Oh, please, you flatter me with your background, which is actually my first question that I want to get into. So I know a little bit about your background, but for the audience out there, just let it go. Let's see what you got.
Well, outside of being a legend in my own mind, I was fortunate. I spent 31 years in the federal government in the United States and 28 as an FBI agent. And during that time, I had the great pleasure and honor of working a number of very exciting and very important investigations. I was early in my career as a case agent in the case we referred to as Libya Gate, which was a huge corruption case. And then I was in the early 90s, I was the case agent in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International bank failure. And ultimately, toward the end of my career, I ran the financial crimes program in the FBI. And I was in a position after 9/11 to respond and form a financial investigation that really led to identifying the hijack, well, ultimately proving the hijackers responsible for being aligned with Al Qaeda.
Wow, that's I know you're being modest, and I know there's a lot more. Hopefully we could dive into it. But I guess my first question, because of your current role, you're consulting others, what do you see as like current hot topics in the money laundering world, more first at a domestic level?
Yeah, well, there's just so many things you can go, so many directions you can go in. So from a domestic U.S. standpoint, I like to frame it around the FinCEN guidance from 2021, the 8 priorities, and clearly, those 8 priorities, I think they're global as well as domestic. So, you've got the fentanyl problem today is at hand, and you've got all types of counterfeit goods and smuggling going on, human smuggling, human trafficking. It's horrendous. Frauds, elder fraud in particular. In fact, we just did a session last week here in the DC area, our local chapter of ACAMS. We did an annual year in review, and I moderated the law enforcement panel, and we had representatives from the FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, and the Internal Revenue Service. And they all concurred that elder fraud continues to be a huge problem. And also, I think, along with that, the idea, when you talk about drugs and you talk about human trafficking, and obviously then you're going to bring in your transnational criminal organizations, your domestic criminal organizations as well. We're all opportunists, and they look for the different opportunities. But where I wanted to go with this, and I think this might even bleed into your next question a little bit, is that regardless of the crime problem, there's a financial dimension to it, right. And we should always be looking to include financial investigative element in every one of these situations. So money laundering is a key, regardless of what the crime problem is. There's going to be a demand to launder the money, right. And if financial institutions are used, and invariably they're going to be used in some form, there's going to be an element of fraud in those cases. So fraud then and money laundering are just ingrained in all criminal problems.
No, that's a good answer. So looking at more of an international level, like I'm not sure about elder abuse being more international, yeah. But what are some of the issues you see at like a more broader perspective?
Well, what I didn't mention before, and here's a good point for it, is corruption. Corruption across the board, whether it's here in the United States at all different levels. Global corruption is really a problem, and I didn't touch on, and I think my big background over at the end of my bureau career was terrorist financing. So
Right.
terrorism is a huge problem all over the place. And if you look at what's gone on in the last few days in Germany, they just arrested 25 individuals with right-wing, very serious right-wing affiliations, and they were actually planning to overthrow the government. So I mean that case is just gaining traction. So it's going to be amazing to see that. So I think that's a big problem. And if you look at it then and put terrorism in context with transnational crime, the nexus between terrorist organizations and transnational criminal groups, that's all based around drug trafficking, human trafficking, and smuggling and other crimes to raise the capital. I think, from a terrorism standpoint, over time, we've done a really good job in sanctioning and really disrupting funding flows to terrorist organizations.
Right.
So consequently, they've had to align with criminal organizations to raise funds. And the only way they could do that is through criminal activity. Most prominently would be the drug trafficking and the human trafficking.
Mm-hmm. So, interesting, as far as you brought up a sanction, right? It's occurring, but for example, with Russia, it seems like it had an impact, but not a huge impact. Do you view that as something that's not just to Russia, to other nations as well?
Not as much, but yes, I think that, and it's amazing you bring this up. I was talking to a good friend just the other day, and he's a sanctions expert, and he was commenting about, that the impact of the sanctions hasn't been as severe as what we thought on Russia, hasn't been as severe as what we anticipated. And that just tells me that Russia had alternative routes to bring money in. And so that they anticipated sanctions and they had their mechanisms in place to circumvent them. So to the broader question you asked, Iran, they're masters at this. What Iran is able to do is they have to get into the financial system, and so they find their workarounds around the sanctions through front companies, shell companies, through business fronts or through whatever legitimate means they can, and then in certain instances aligning with other countries friendly to them so that they can circumvent whatever the control mechanisms are, that the sanctions bring.
So what you're saying is that Russia, Iran, and other nations were being proactive, planning ahead because they knew the sanctions were probably coming.
Yeah, and I know we didn't pre-plan this or anything, but you just bring up a good idea. I mean, a good talking point that what we do in the anti-money laundering space, and from a criminal investigative standpoint, most of the time, is inherently reactive. We're reacting to identifying suspicious activity. We're reacting to frauds. We're reacting to whatever the crime problem is. And so that gives the bad actors, whether it's state actors or whether it's individuals or organizations, that gives them a distinct advantage because they can be proactive. And one of the things that I've found that's worked very well for me is to, and I think from a financial investigative standpoint, where we have the ability to become proactive and in a sense weaponize financial intelligence. If you think about it, I don't know if we, I hate using the word weaponize in a sense, but from the standpoint of conducting an investigation, wherever I could weaponize financial intelligence, that was really very disruptive and disabling to the criminal enterprises or to the individuals we were investigating.
That's good. Now that's going to lead to my next question regarding financial intelligence. So, I mean, the sources, I'm probably not familiar as much as you are, but where did you get your source from, the information?
Well, I think, this goes to kind of the fundamental background there is the idea of following the money. And so basically, when you look at our financial system, financial institutions are either facilitation tools or detection mechanisms when it comes to the flow of funds and illicit funds. And at some point, financial institutions are going to be touch points for, the bad guys are going to move money however they can. They're going to move it through the formal financial system or through informal mechanisms. And when I worked at terrorist financing, for instance, what we found was in a lot of areas where you're dealing in cash-based societies, they're using the hawala and the informal money transfers. And I think, along those lines, when going back to one of your first questions about what are the crime problems that we have, I think one of the biggest vulnerable points we have in the United States, and I believe it really impacts every country around the world, are how many businesses are operating as illegal money transmitters. And the financial institutions, they look at that, whether it's a mom and pop grocery store, a gas station, a travel agency or something. Are they receiving services, for illegal money transmission, and the banks don't have, they're not able to detect that. And I think that is a huge problem in the United States. I like to use, I do a lot of training, and one of the case studies that I use to illustrate this point is a case that came out of New York, the Carnival ice cream shop. Carnival ice cream shop was Brooklyn, Queens, New York, under an elevated train station. If you go out and you Google Carnival ice cream, you'll see, this storefront, and it's a dingy storefront. And yet over the period of a certain amount of years, I think it was like 22 or $23 million flowed through this shop that ultimately was transmitted to Pakistan and Yemen, and probably because that neighborhood was a lot of ethnic Pakistanis and Yemenis.
Well, Dennis, this has been great having you on, and I definitely want to bring you back again. Going through the corruption issues, the follow the money and everything, I definitely want to explore that further. So thank you for joining. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, and thank you, Justin. I appreciate what you're doing, and getting this message out is a great platform.
Absolutely.